We will now hear from Ms. Charlaine Chin of the Medical Legal Society of Malaysia, who will give us a lecture on telemedicine and the law, which is very interesting now in this era. Ms. Chin is a member of Honourable Society of the Middle Temple after being admitted to the Bar of England and Wales in 2010, and as an advocate and solicitor of High Court of Malaysia in 2012. She is active in medical legal litigation and administrative proceeding in her practice and has been involved in a number of reported cases. Without further ado, please welcome Ms. Chin.
Thank you very much, Prof. An absolute honor to be here today. Salam sejahtera and a very good morning to all of you tuning in today. I'm just going to very quickly pull up my slides. All right. There we go. Okay. Right. Now, the topic today is telemedicine and the law. Right. As Prof mentioned earlier on, it actually isn't something new. But the pandemic has really brought it to the forefront. And I think the title for today's webinar is so apt, the specialist in the fast-changing world. And I think if there's anything that has demonstrated that our world is truly changing fast, I think it is this area of telemedicine. All right, I now move on to first slide. I'm going to talk, this is briefly the topics I will be covering. I'll just talk a little bit about definitions because I just want to show a common thread among the definitions, and then the legislation in Malaysia, the standard of care, consent, and then prescribing and or dispensing medication. And then I will talk about a few other issues, okay? All right, I'll jump straight to the definition of telemedicine. Now, let's look at what WHO defines telemedicine as. The delivery of healthcare services where distance is a critical factor by all healthcare professionals using information and communications technologies for the exchange of valid information for diagnosis, treatment, and prevention of disease and injuries, and it goes on. Okay, now I just want you to focus on the first three lines of this definition. It's the giving of healthcare services where distance is a critical factor. We've seen that of late, right? All of us have been, really cooped up in our houses or in our own places, and that has now been a factor. And then the second important part is where healthcare professionals use ICT, information and communications technologies. All right, so that's what WHO says telemedicine is. Let's look at what the layman says telemedicine is. Okay, so the Oxford Language Dictionary defines telemedicine as a system that uses internet and telecommunications technology to provide a wide range of healthcare services as telemedicine, education, patient care management, and remote monitoring of vital signs. So, sorry, you probably can hear my daughter in the background. So you can see that again, the definition of internet and telecommunications technology appears again. And if you look at the bottom of the screen, this is the definition that's provided by our own Malaysian Medical Council. Okay, so first they say virtual consultation is a form of telemedicine. I think that's been established, right? But they've defined telemedicine as a medical service provided remotely via information and communication technology. So you see, WHO, the layman's definition, as well as our own MMC's definition of telemedicine, all has a common denominator, and that's the use of internet and telecommunications technology or information and communications technology. So just bear that in mind as we go on for the next half an hour, all right? So let's talk a little bit about legislation in Malaysia. Now we'll talk about acts of parliament. The first thing that probably comes to mind is the Telemedicine Act. I don't know if you all know that we actually have this. It was, if you look at the year, it was drafted in 1997. Okay, it probably drafted a bit earlier, right? Because you have to go through several readings in Parliament, but it is not enforced, so it's not applicable. And I think this just reinforces the fact that telemedicine isn't something new, right? I think with the emergence of the internet, it's something we already sort of envisage could happen. Okay, but until today, rather oddly, if I could use that word, it's not enforced yet. Okay, now what other acts do we have? You've got the Medical Act. So the Medical Act will govern the registration of medical practitioners as well as the practice of medicine. Okay, I won't go into the detailed subsections because I'm going to bore the hell out of you. Okay, I'm just going to go very briefly. If you have any specific questions, please put it in the Q&A and I'll try to address it as best as I can. And then you've also got the Medicines Advertisement and Sale Act, 1956. I think it's 56 that I think speaks for itself. And then you've got the PDPA, the Personal Data Protection Act. Very important. When we go virtual, a very big issue actually is data protection. Okay, so the PDPA now comes into play when previously I think it was perhaps more towards confidentiality, and now it's taken on, I think, a new dimension altogether when it comes to telemedicine. And for those of you who are in private practice or who are going on to private practice, always remember you've got the Private Healthcare Facilities and Services Act, such a thing act, but it got very detailed guidelines there as well. Now, ethical guidelines, Dr. Anit in the first session spoke about the various guidelines which the MMC has. And the first on the list, of course, is the advisory on virtual consultation. And the title actually says during the COVID-19 pandemic, because they're very specific to say that these guidelines should only apply during this pandemic. There's a proviso at the end of the guidelines, okay? And I must commend the Malaysian Medical Council for being so timely in publishing these guidelines. We went into lockdown on the 18th of March, 2020, and I think these guidelines came out sometime in April. There isn't a specific date, but I recall it coming up sometime in April 2020. So please have a read of that. And then there's this a long list of guidelines which are still applicable even when we do telemedicine. Okay, so you've got the CPC, Code of Professional Conduct, of course, good medical practice, guidelines on consent, and then the guidelines on audio and visual recordings, which was always sort of in the back burner, never really used, and it's really come to the forefront now. Okay, then you've also got guidelines on confidentiality, because now with everything virtual, confidentiality is also now an issue. Okay, and then the guidelines for good dispensing practice, and this is not an exhaustive list. Okay, all these lists are not exhaustive, so there can be more to this list. Okay, the Ministry of Health also has some guidelines. These are just a couple. A guide to good dispensing practice, and the Perkeliling Media Social, which is also quite important actually. All right, so this is by and large the legislation and the regulations, including the guidelines, which are available in Malaysia. They're actually all available online, which is really good. If you are looking for an act of parliament, please visit the website of the Attorney General's Chambers, AGC. Okay, if you're looking at for the MMC guidelines, go to the MMC website. They're all there. And if you need guidelines from the MOH, of course, visit MOH's guideline website. So I move on now to the next issue, the standard of care. Now, why is this important? Because often we talk about telemedicine and our focus is a lot about, the platform that we use, the peculiarities that come with telemedicine. But really, we forget the most important thing. What is my standard of care when I'm using a virtual platform to carry out the practice of medicine? Okay, Dr. Hassan, a pro in this area, has gone in depth in it, so I won't repeat what he said. I've summarized everything in a single slide. Now we know that doctors, you have two different duties. Okay, so on the left hand side is the duty to diagnose and treat, and then on the right hand side is the duty to advise of risk. Now both of these duties have been clarified and established by the federal court, in this case called Zohasnima, and it was reported in 2017. Now let's talk about diagnosis and treatment first. When we talk about that duty, the standard of care that's expected of doctors is the Bolam and the Bolito test. I'm sure we've heard of it, right? What's the Bolam test? Essentially what the Bolam test is, you must act in accordance with a practice that's accepted as proper by a reasonable body of medical men skilled in that particular art. Okay, what does that mean? Lawyers, we like to always make things sound as though it's glamorous, but actually, it can be said much simpler. Basically, what it means is you must act in accordance with what is deemed reasonable by your fellow peers of your specialty. Dr. Hassan mentioned earlier on, if we're judging a cardiologist, then it has to be in reference to a standard that's accepted as proper by a group of cardiologists, right? And if you're a medical officer, then it has to be a standard that is expected and accepted as proper by a group of medical officers. So the standard in which you compare is very important, okay? So that's the standard of care. And then the advice of risk. The advice of risk, we look at the test in Rogers and Whittaker. It's an Australian test, okay? Now, what does that actually mean? We know you must advise the patient of material risks. What's material risk? It really is what it says, material. So it must be risk which the patient finds significant or the patient finds important. Okay. Now, this two duties on its own is very, very in-depth. I won't go any further except to just summarize. So this is the standard duty when it comes to diagnosis and treatment and the advice of risk that's expected of a doctor. Okay, normal practice of medicine. So when I go on and do a virtual consultation and I'm doing telemedicine, the golden question ultimately is, should the standard of care remain the same for teleconsultations? I wish this was a physical a webinar or a physical session, because I would actually ask a show of hands. Now it's all on the slide, right? But it's still untested in Malaysia, but I think arguably it has to be the same standard. Now in India, in about more than a year ago, March 2020, they then published their telemedicine guidelines, and they expressly provide in those guidelines that doctors must maintain the same standard of care during a teleconsultation as they would in an in-person consultation. And I think that's absolutely fair, right? Just because the platform changes, the standard shouldn't change. It should remain the same. But of course, there's a different dimension to it, and I will discuss this as I go along, right? Let's talk a little bit about the practical side of things. I used the word dimensions earlier on. So how is it different really, telemedicine versus a physical consultation? The practical tip number one is always ensure the appropriateness of teleconsultation. Okay, whenever in doubt, ensure that a timely in-person consultation is scheduled. Simply said, if telemedicine is not the appropriate method or platform, please don't feel ashamed or don't feel afraid to convert that into an in-person consultation. And when you make that conversion, it has to be timely as well. So you can't say, oh, okay, you're seeing me today. Never mind, I think we can't go on today, but you come back next week. You know what I mean? You have to make sure there's a timely in-person consultation. Let me give you an actual example. Let's say a patient consults you on telemedicine, yeah, on a virtual consultation. And the patient comes and complains of extreme abdominal pain. Your next question will probably be, okay, can you describe where is the pain? And the patient might just say, oh, it's just at my stomach. It's just in the middle of my stomach. So it's general, right? Now, in your mind, you may think, okay, it could be acute gastritis, all right? But it could also be appendicitis, right? It may present itself as a general pain before it localizes to the right iliac fossa, for example. Now, without the ability to physically palpate the patient's abdomen, you might not come to the right diagnosis, okay? And the reason why I've actually given this specific example is because this actually happened to my husband, right? It turned out he had a perforated appendicitis. Okay, but because he wasn't able to do the palpitation physically, I suspect that's where things may have, gone wrong, right? So always bear in mind, is this medium the appropriate platform or not? Number two, ensure all notes from the teleconsultation are incorporated into the patient's medical records. I know notes and the admin side of things is really the bane of most practitioners, but it's no different when you do it in a virtual consultation. You have to make sure that the notes you take down or whatever that happens or transpires during this telemedicine consultation forms part of the patient's medical records, okay? Remember the second duty, to advise of risk. Now, when you're advising of risk, always make sure that you customize the advice of risk according to the patient in front of you. Now, the thing with telemedicine is that you sometimes forget, right? Because you're it removes all borders. So you sometimes forget where you are, or more importantly, where the patient is, right? For example, you may have in the morning, a patient from the heart of KL sitting before you. And then in the afternoon, you could have a patient from Kota Belud in Sabah, for example. The way you give your advice to both these patients will be very different. But sometimes when you on the virtual platform, these are things which may escape our mind. We may not necessarily be alive of that. We know it, yeah, but we might sometimes forget it during the consultation. You see? And when it comes to advising of risk, why is the customization important? It's because it's not what the doctor thinks I should advise, it's what the patient finds important. All right? So always bear that in mind. And of course, when it comes to advising of risk or taking a consent, document, right? And finally, if you want to record the teleconsultation, that can be done. Okay, but please, it is ethically right, I think, to inform the patient that you want to do so and get their consent. All right. So that's the standard of care. I now move on very quickly to consent. Okay, these are again the very broad legal principles of what the court requires when it comes to consent. Okay, I just go through very briefly. On the part of the doctor, you must advise the patient or you must inform the patient of the broad terms of the nature. So you don't have to go into specifics. You don't even have to use medical terms. In fact, you shouldn't try to use medical terms. Try and use layman terms, easier to understand. Okay, so just the broad nature of the procedure that you're going to do. The second issue is, or the second requirement is, the patient must understand. All right. And after the patient understands, the patient must voluntarily agree. Okay, so these are the three broad ingredients for valid consent. So the same question, should the same requirements also apply when we talk about consent with teleconsultations? I think it should. Yeah, there's no reason why it shouldn't apply. But always remember to advise the patient of the risks, the limitations, and other issues which may be associated with teleconsultations. And let's look at what these risks are. Number one, always document the consent-taking process in your clinical notes. If you are recording the process, then that recording has to be part of the medical records. Okay? If the patient consents for the surgery or the treatment through an e-document, for example, you must make sure that that e-document is captured and is able to form part of the patient's medical records as well. Okay. Next, ensure that the patient understands the information and advice conveyed. All right. So practical advice, if you're not sure, ask the patient to just, re-explain it in their own words. And the third, and I think the most important, be aware of the limitations that could render a teleconsultation inadequate. For example, poor internet connection, right? Communication is so important. And I echo what Dr. Hassan said. It usually is the basic reason as to why a patient becomes unhappy. So a lot of MMC complaints, a lot of the suits, we find there's a miscommunication. Even in practice, when we are attending the inquiry before the medical counsel, we're defending the doctors, or in court, when I'm cross-examining a witness, for example, the witness will always say the opposite of what the doctor says he or she said, right? So it's always a communication issue. And more so when we talk about virtual consultations. If your connection, for example, is not stable, one or two words go missing, the whole sentence can change context. Okay, so just be very aware of it. Wait until you have a good connection, check it with the patient. Can you see me clearly? Am I clearly audible to you? Make sure the patient confirms. You might want to actually note it down in your notes as well. Yeah, okay. All right, now let's talk a little bit about prescribing and or dispensing medication. Now, prescriptions via electronic means is only advisable if we have adequate knowledge of the patient's health, okay? And if you are satisfied that the medicine would serve the patient's needs. Now, the second point is very important here. You should only prescribe medication to an existing patient after consulting the patient's existing medical records. So the very important factor here is wherever you do this teleconferencing or this virtual consultation, make sure you have access to the patient's medical records. Please don't just rely on what you see on the screen. It was exactly the same as you have a physical consultation. Okay, if you do not have the patient's medical records, you don't have access to that. Let's say if partial notes are available online and partial are not, and if you feel there is doubt or you feel more comfortable having perused the entire set of the medical records, then please do so and only then do your prescription. Okay. And the Malaysian Medical Council guidelines specifically on telemedicine says that we have to ensure that patients with cognitive disorders, if they're intoxicated or you sense or you think that they could be, or if there are language barriers even, then all these types of patients have to be seen physically. Okay. Now, when we talk about prescribing or dispensing, please consider these three things. Again, the limitations of the medium of communication. Okay, because it's not just a question of prescribing, it's also the question of making sure the patient understands the type of medication that's being prescribed, the frequency and the manner in which the medication ought to be taken by the patient, also equally important. Okay. Secondly, the need for physical examination or other assessments. If you feel you need to do further tests, and if those tests can only be done physically, then please consider that before you prescribe or dispense any medication. Okay. And thirdly, again, always make sure you have access to the patient's medical records, because there really isn't a defense if anything happens before the MMC and the patient, we found out that there's actually a notation in the medical records, but you didn't have access to the records or full access to the records, and then an adverse outcome happens. What are you going to say? Very difficult to defend. So please always remember these limitations. All right, now move on to other issues. These are actually small issues, but I feel they're very important, especially when we talk about telemedicine. Okay, number one, identification. Confirm and verify the patient's identity by name, age, address, phone number, or registered ID, or any other forms of dependable identification. Perhaps I should add the word there. Okay. Now, I think this is something which most doctors are not used to doing, right? Usually a patient walks in, your nurse will do the necessary, and the patient walks in, and then you're just like, yes, tuan puan, or, auntie, uncle, what's the problem today? Always remember now with telemedicine, you have to verify and confirm the patient's identity. Why? You need to make sure you know who's sitting in front of you, right? There's a lot of issues here. It's got data protection issues. You've got confidentiality issues. So it's a myriad of things, all right? And also, likewise, you have to make sure that your identity and your place of practice, registration status, all these are made known to the patient. This is actually provided for in MMC's guidelines, okay? The third point, equally important, the identities of the other participants in the teleconsultation must also be disclosed. So for example, right, in this current frame that you have now, you only see me. Okay, I assure you there's no one else in the room with me. But let's say if you're doing a teleconsultation, and let's say your nurse is seated at the side, or I don't know, someone else, okay? Should only be healthcare professionals, but if there's anyone else in the room with you, you have to disclose this identity regardless of whether they appear on the screen. Okay, and you have to get the patient to approve, because in the course of your consultation, you are going to be disclosing highly confidential information. And likewise, people who appear in the patient's screen as well, or the area, always good to just identify who these people are. Similarly, you won't just allow anybody to come into your consultation room or your clinic, right? So the same principle would apply when you're having a teleconsultation. Okay, so that's identification. Let's talk a little bit about virtual platforms. I'm guessing that the group, if you're master students, I think you're fairly young. I'd like to use the word we. Maybe the younger generation are a bit more familiar with technology. Okay, but still, please don't take it for granted. Okay, now when we talk about virtual platforms, it should be carried out only in audio and video conferencing. Okay, text-based applications, not advisable, because there's so many you're unable to identify who the person is on the other side. You can't see anything, you can't hear anything. And a lot of times, just like how when you ask a lawyer a question or advice, they always say, oh, but it depends on the facts. Likely. So when you talk about text-based applications, that's the difficulty, right? That you don't have the proper picture. And when you don't have the proper picture, it's very difficult to decide the way forward, right? Now, on this note, please have a read of MOH's guidelines on the use of social media, because they actually prohibit platforms such as Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, or blogs. Okay, you shouldn't do consultations on this mode. They're not saying you can't use Facebook or Twitter or YouTube. No, when it comes to consultations, you can't have a consultation through these platforms, right? Confidentiality, it's a word we often hear, and I think it's reinforced when we talk about telemedicine. When you practice telemedicine, a healthcare professional owes the same professional responsibilities for confidentiality as physical consultations. This is expressly provided for in our MMC's guideline. So please be very mindful of the place in which you conduct your teleconsultations. Okay. Nobody may be disturbing you, but for example, if you're sitting in your living room and your spouse or your children or your parents are also in the same vicinity, and if you're not wearing earphones and you're on speaker, it may be a breach of confidentiality if, for example, the information that they get has leaked out or used in a wrong manner. In fact, it doesn't have to go so far. The fact that there's unauthorized disclosure is a breach of confidentiality. So always be careful of where you do it. Yeah. And it's always good practice, I think, to do it in the same place that, it's a safe space. You've got proper lighting, you've got proper internet connection, you've got your whatever tools you need or whatever documents or, that you need, all right? And thirdly, ensure that the patient is also in a suitable environment, right? Sometimes, I don't know, people are always constantly on the go. And I think because having been cooped up at home for 1.5 years, everyone wants to now probably go out the minute they can. Maybe not doctors, maybe not doctors, all right? So you may get patients who, they might be dialing in for a consultation while they are driving, and literally you're just looking at their chin while they're driving. Oh, sorry, doc, I'm driving. You know what I mean? If you're not comfortable, stop that consultation and maybe reschedule a different time, or you might want to ask them to find a suitable place. So where the patient conducts that teleconference or that teleconsultation is equally as important, okay? Professional fees, a very prickly topic, I think, for maybe those of you all who are in private practice more so than in government practice. But I think ultimately it has to be based on a reasonable amount, okay? For private practitioners, the fee schedule in the PHFSA, the Private Healthcare and Services Act, does not provide for a particular fees for teleconsultation. But I think there's an overriding, I think, duty for doctors to charge a reasonable amount, okay? Now, this is very important, and I just thought I'd put a picture to emphasize the importance, okay? Training and familiarization of the platform is so important. You must be comfortable with the platform that you're using, all right? So for example, and if you are not, it's always good to train and practice how to use that platform, okay? And take your time, don't rush. Okay. For example, if you can't see the patient clearly, clarify. I'm sorry, but I can't really see you clearly. Is it at my end? Is it at the patient's end? So it's so important. And I think if there's trip-ups, it's usually when doctors go beyond what they're familiar with. Okay, and especially when we're talking about the platform. Okay. And if Dr. Hassan ended with, he didn't end, he spoke about the 4 Ds, I think, of medical negligence, the anatomy of medical negligence. I'll end with the 5 Cs, okay? Now, number 1, comply. Comply with ethical, professional, and legal obligations, okay? And bear in mind the added obligations and limitations of technology. Why do I use the word added? Because you notice actually what I've gone through is the traditional legal principles still remain. But in addition to those traditional principles, we've got this added and ancillary legislation, guidelines, and issues which come into play when we do a telemedicine. Okay, so always comply. Consider if remote consultation is viable in any given situation. So this is really about the suitability. Is it suitable or not? If it's not suitable, immediately change it to a physical consultation. Third, clinical judgment. This must be exercised in assessing whether a telemedicine is appropriate for a patient. And remember, not every patient is the same. In fact, every single patient is different. Their circumstances are different. Their presenting symptoms may also be different. So always don't take for granted. Yeah, every time you have a telemedicine or teleconsultation, always review as to whether it's appropriate or not. Fourth, consent. Now, consent taking must include the provision of added risks and limitation in telemedicine. Okay, so for example, when you're giving consent, you might want to speak to the patient a bit more. You may, in person, you can probably observe the non-verbal cues, the body language of the patient. If they're, for example, if they're hesitant about a particular surgery, for example, they may be clenching their fist. You can't see my fist at all now. You don't know what I'm doing neck down, right? So it's very important, I think, to be aware of these limitations and to engage with the patient a bit more. And finally, check. Please check with your professional indemnity providers. It's now compulsory under the law, okay? if providing telemedicine is actually covered. That's quite important actually, okay? And the extent of your coverage. Now, please also check if jurisdictional requirements are required for cross-border telehealth consultations. This is an entire topic altogether. But remember, now because the borders are removed, it doesn't mean that you're free to just do it wherever you are. You may have a patient, for example, in New Zealand. Okay, you have to ask yourself, look, are there requirements that I need to apply to, or adhere to? The patient may be, for example, in Singapore, in Australia. All right, so always be mindful of those things. That's all from me. Thank you very much. I hand over the time now back to you, Prof.
Thank you very much, Ms. Charlaine, for a very different view of telemedicine from what I had before.